Welcome to another session. I hope you're well. As always, it's a pleasure to have you join. In today's session, I am going to be speaking to the topic why relationships are so hard. Why relationships are so hard. But before I start, let me preface today's conversation with a few sentences or statements. Falling in love is natural. It comes naturally. Staying in love is unnatural. It is not a natural process. Now let me put those statements together and describe it in a different or using different words. Falling in love is something that occurs without effort. It occurs effortlessly. Staying in love or remaining in love requires much effort. The first, or the former, which is falling in love, requires often no work, no preparation, often requires no discipline, no structure, no boundaries. The heart leads us and we follow wherever the heart leads us. It's a beautiful experience. It's a beautiful observation to behold. When presented as a story, some of us actually are driven to tears. We get a sense of inspiration and adoration and excitement just from being part of or connecting to a love story, because every part of our being automatically is drawn to love. It comes naturally. Staying in love, on the other hand, requires work. It requires effort. It requires discipline. It requires boundaries. It requires a vision. It requires a mission, a purpose, a plan, goals, daily tasks, routines, all of which, and most of which, often are boring. And the reason most people consider relationships to be something hard is because we expect that the ease through which we fell in love would be the only energy required, and it should be just as easy as maintaining a relationship or our relationships. Unfortunately, the opposite is the case. Let me use an example. I think most people will understand this example. Planting a seed, just say a seed of corn. If you are a farmer and you're handed there's baskets of corn seeds, taking each seed and planting the seed in the soil is often easy, because if we assume the soil is nurtured and laid, all you have to do is plant the seeds. On the other hand, once the seed is planted, the energy required to maintain, to nurture, to protect, to preserve the soil until the seed gets to its natural gestation period and produces a sapling and produces something that bears fruit. The energy required far exceeds the energy devoted to putting that seed in the soil. And between the season of sowing and the season of reaping, we have the time I call the wait. And a lot of work is done during that period. And once the harvest comes or begins, the harvest doesn't just appear on one simple sunny evening or afternoon. It's a seasonal thing. It takes days, hours, days, months, sometimes years. And during that phase, there is still work that is needed. When the harvest comes, the work required during the harvest season is even sometimes more intense. the amount of manpower, man hours, labor needed to harvest, to cultivate, and then to present what you have produced, even far exceeds what was required in the earlier stages. Falling in love will be similar to just planting a seed, and it starts to blossom by its own natural accord. Staying in love is the work needed to maintain and protect that soil once the seed is in the soil. The work required to go through the phase of harvest, the work required for the processing, the harvesting and processing of what has been produced. All of that requires work and effort. Now, this is partly part of the reason why relationships are hard. I'm going to take it a step further. I'm going to say a few things that perhaps for some people might be uncomfortable. For some, I think it should be liberating. Most of us, unfortunately, we are products, not of our environment, though important, not of, you might say, happenstance or luck. We are product of our parents. We are simply programmed seeds that our parents, by omission or commission, have created. Now, the reason I use that example is to say as follows. I'm going to speak to ladies in this particular instance. I have found that when I look at men and I look at women in the UK particularly, I am stunned, especially men who are of marriageable age, 18 and above. I am stunned at how often I hear the following words or sentences or statements that amount to things such as, I don't need a man. I had a conversation some time ago and I made something that I thought was an observable reality across the entire people who were present. I said, I've never met a man, and this is a true statement, I have never met a man who says, I do not need women. I don't need a woman in my life. I am strong, I'm independent, and I don't need no woman. Never met a man who said those statements. As a matter of fact, what I meet and see are boys from the age of 16, sometimes younger, all the way up to men who are 80, sometimes over. And at the core is this longing for a woman's presence, a woman's love and affection, the admiration of a woman, plus this deep necessity to provide, to protect, to profess his love, and to be the priest to a woman that he loves. Men naturally, instinctively, we are drawn to women. Whether that be biological or societal, that need has remained from the dawn of the ages up until the modern times. Men do not make statements that go against what is biologically a necessity. Now, I also said in the statement, I've never heard a man say, I don't need a woman. Despite men not needing women for survival, but only requiring them for reproductive intentions and reproductive goals. Let me say that again. Men do not need women to survive. Men need women to reproduce with. Part of the reason is not because women are not needed or wanted. It's more so from the fact that we, as men, are able to survive in the world that we created. What I have heard and what I continue to hear and see, which I find quite alarming, is women from 18 and above, marriageable age, who very often say, I don't need men. I don't need a man. And sometimes this statement is made so much so, steeped with ignorance, no history, no knowledge of history, no awareness of the uniqueness of each party. But you see women say, well, I am strong, independent. I tend to find it funny that several adjectives are used to describe women whenever a woman is describing herself. It's either strong, It's either independent, it's either self-sustaining, but does not need a man, can survive without a man in this natural world to the end of their lives. And I find it fascinating. And in the conversation I said, how is it possible that the sex that can survive, that has the ability, both by design, by temperament, and by choice and desire, the sex that has the ability to survive and thrive, that's the key word, survive and thrive, is the sex that does not say it doesn't need the opposite gender, but rather says, what would we do without women? How dark and sad would this world be without women? However, the sex that requires the opposite gender, both for reproduction and for survival, but more importantly, for survival, are the ones exclaiming that they do not need men. Fascinating. And what I see here is, unfortunately, an ideology that is so steep that most people are not aware of it, primarily because we are seeds of our parents. We've been programmed by our parents. I'll give you a few examples of what I intend to convey in the next few minutes. I have met women who have come from a two-parent family. I have met women who have come from single-parent family. And what I find in common between both, and this is a majority of the cases, is the women who have come from two-parent family have the same ideology and mindset that the women who were raised without fathers into a single-parent family. There is no distinction. There is no difference. Or rather, you could say it's a distinction without a difference. Both groups have outcomes that are consistent. Now, how is this possible? Now, I know, and you know, that if we go back many, many, many years ago, a child that was born into a single parent family, from an outcome perspective in terms of general performance, despite how loving the single parent may have been, if it was a single parent being a mother, if you compare that child to a child that was raised by a loving two-parent family with traditional gender roles, the masculine and the feminine archetype in place, there will be a subtle difference in outcomes before we started to adjust. But all things held equal, there is a difference. The data on this is clear. So we know that there should be, you might say, a distinction that is evident. However, when we look at women, young women these days, born to single parent family, and we look at their outcomes and their aspirations, and we compare them to women who were born into families and come from families where both parents are married and perhaps are still married, we see a similarity in outcomes and a similarity in intention and goals. The key question is why? Why? I think that's fascinating. For someone who thinks like a social scientist, I find it fascinating. Something that we should study. I'm going to share some ideas that perhaps could be at the root of. They may not be causal, but they're certainly correlated at a very high percentage. My conclusions are as follows, and I'll deal with one major conclusion. The conclusion is that mothers, unfortunately, even particular women, and I'm going to speak firstly to this first group, the group of women who come from two-parent families, their daughters were simply supposed to be, you might say, an experiment through which their mothers lived the life that they wished that they could have lived. And they do so through their daughters. Therefore, the outcomes that the daughters are having are not necessarily choices. Obviously, adults, so they're responsible for their outcomes, but they're not necessarily choices that the young children made very early, but rather ideologies, indoctrinations, conditioned behavior imposed by their mothers into the children In other words, planting the seed into the soil, so much so that the harvest was guaranteed to be no different from the actual seed. I'll give you a useful example. A woman is married, but she may have come from a broken family. She may have come from a family where she didn't really have a relationship with her father. She may have come from a relationship whereby, or a family whereby, she saw her father leave and saw her mother struggle. She got married. She had kids. Not one and not two, but she had kids. The fear in her subconscious mind, born, created from a place of ignorance, and you've heard me say this before, any decision made from a place of ignorance, ignorance always creates worry and doubt. Worry and doubt will always manifest itself in the form of fear. Fear has to translate from a mental experience or an emotional experience into a physical experience through the body in the form of anxiety. Anxiety, unfortunately, the way we treat anxiety is to repress anxiety. Anxiety that is repressed would always lead to a state of chaos, to a state whereby you're in a feeling in a state of depression. You're in a state of disease. You're not at ease. That fear will continue to self-sabotage you in your decisions and the decisions you make. It will lead to destruction. Sometimes it will lead to death. That death may not be physical death. It could be the death of a relationship, the death of an idea, the death of fulfillment and happiness. A lot of these women, despite being married, despite having the opportunity to rewrite the script, they held on to the script that was given to them by their lived experience as children or installed in them by their parents. So much so that you can see women who are married, who are successfully married, who have kids, and you look at the outcomes of their children, and what you see is not what was modeled to those young children. It's the opposite. And the key question is why? Well, one of the reasons for that is simply because their mothers attempted to live a different life through their children by installing in those kids ideas that have germinated and have borne fruit. So much so that you can see these women are the ones who are saying, I don't need a man. I can be just fine by myself. I can survive and I can thrive without a relationship or without a man. Despite having come from a successful two-parent family where they saw the love of a father and the nurturing of a mother in full effect, yet their behaviors are not consistent with the results of their mothers. They are the opposite. The reason? Their mothers created, let's use the word an inception, planted a seed in their mind, and that seed started to bear fruit. And the harvest is such that the outcomes of the children diverge from the results of their mothers. And you have these young girls rationalizing their outcomes. Now, rationalizing simply means you're rationing lies. These are lies told to them, but they believe it. And what you tend to find is these women, the mothers, created kids that were selfish. Here's the first thing, selfish. They lacked self-awareness. They were self-absorbed, so much so that when it comes to relationships, which is where I am focusing on, they're so selfish in relationships. They want it all. Mothers told their daughters, you can have it all. There are no such things as trade-offs. There are no such things as constraints. There are no such things as consequences. And there are no costs. You just make your choices and everything will fall in line according to your desires. And these mothers have seen their daughters go from 18 years, go into college, succeed in college, go into the world, succeed in the area of business and careers and professions and jobs, but fail when it comes to relationships, fail when it comes to intimacy and creating affection that is long-lasting with a a man of significance or value. Why? Because there's an ideology, a seed in their subconscious mind, based on that fear planted by mother, experienced by their mothers, but nurtured into the young children, so much so that whilst you have two separate generations, the children have seen with their two eyes the benefits of a two-parent family, the benefit of working together, how we are interdependent and how interdependent is the right approach. But they choose an ideology because their mother is living through their children. And here's the key thing. Whilst the children self-sabotage themselves, the mother continues to applaud, despite seeing that the outcomes are not good. They've created selfish children. Number two, they've created children that self-sabotage their success. These are the same women who a relationship is going well, and there will always be a reason why it comes to an end. Sometimes it's the third voice. Sometimes it's the wrong voices. But as a result of not being able to, number three, self-sustain a relationship, they self-sabotage because of their selfishness. Now, there are three S's so far: selfishness, self-sabotage, and the inability to self-sustain. I started today's session and I said that falling in love comes natural. It should be easy. Staying in love is unnatural. It's hard. It requires work, effort, grit, consistency, sacrifice, self-discipline, boundaries, a vision, a goal, a plan, daily habits, a routine. These mothers raise their children to be free spirits, to shun anything that came from their own grandmothers, such as the family unit, such as the value that comes with choosing delayed gratification, choosing an experience of the future with someone. These are women that taught, despite being successful in their marriages, taught their daughters that marriage and the tradition of marriage and the institution of marriage was like a prison, and it limited them. And therefore, they empowered their daughters to go out into the world and be successful. They told their daughters, being a wife, being a mother, that's not success. Having a job, generating student debt, sometimes it's 6 figures, finding a career, being successful in pursuit of money was success. Here was the sad part of the whole process. They taught their daughters how to be men without equipping their daughters with the desire men have for relationships. I have said in many sessions that these mothers raised a generation of very hard women and very soft men. Feminine men, very masculine women. And by masculinity, I'm talking about disagreeable women, both in temperament and in attitude. They may dress like women, they may speak like women, but they have a Jezebel spirit, a disagreeable spirit, a spirit that contends. We might even use the word, the spirit of Jacob, one who wrestles with God. These women, unfortunately, fail to recognize that in relationships, their significant others want peace. They want serenity. They do not want an adversary. So these daughters from said women, said mothers, self-sabotage. Why? Because fighting was implanted in them, despite them not seeing their parents fight. Why? The sins of the fathers live unto the children, even unto the 3rd and the 4th generations. Their mothers may have witnessed, may have seen, may have experienced conflict between their parents. They transferred that life into their children. Number 4, they created children daughters with little or no self-concept, or with a self-concept that was not consistent with their long-term success. As a result of this, what you find is number 5, there's always self-destruction. So we go backwards. Self-destruction as a result of a poor self-concept based on the inability to self-sustain a relationship, based on self-sabotage at every minute whenever things were supposed to go well as a result of a selfish attitude. Absolutely selfish attitude. And how do you see some of these? These are women young girls who will say, I don't need to be married. But if I do get married, I only want one child. Because they are driven purely based on self. They want a child because they want to know how it may feel to be a mother, but they don't want a husband. They don't want to be married. They would happily have a child out of wedlock. As a matter of fact, here are some interesting statistics. In the UK, in Great Britain, particularly, for women 35 and below, 70% of women 35 or 36 and below who have had children, 70% of those children have come from women who were not married. These were kids having been born out of wedlock. That statistics is consistent with women who are 40 or 39 and below. And let me say that again so you can understand how significant this is. Women who are 36, 35 and below, but extending up to 39 and 40, of the entire group who become mothers, 70% in today's terms, 70% of the children being born are being born to mothers who are not married, and therefore children being born out of wedlock. Becoming a mother is much easier than becoming a wife. Why? Because becoming a mother is easy. The stigma that came from having sex, premarital sex, is gone. The stigma from the risk of pregnancy, thanks to the pill, is here, and therefore the stigma is gone. The stigma of reproducing one child and 2 children before being married or before someone dedicates their life to you is gone. Why? Because their mothers said, be free, be empowered, be independent. Don't trust a man. You don't need a relationship. You can do it all by yourself. Let me bring today's session to a close. Let me share some words of recommendations. I focused on the mothers who were married or who reproduced daughters, but taught their daughters not to live or emulate the life that they led. That's one side of the picture. On the opposite side, we have mothers who never had the man in the family, therefore single mothers, who had children, who went through struggles, who for whatever reason had to endure and improvise to be able to provide enough for the children. The outcomes of those women, and these women perhaps may have made errors in the choice of the men they laid with. In the majority, most of these kids have not come from fathers who died. They've come from fathers who were never going to be there in the first place. They've come from fathers who perhaps never knew that they have children. They come from fathers who were only looking for sex, not looking for a relationship, and therefore not looking to be fathers. Therefore, a choice was made by the woman as a result of the fact women are the ones who are gatekeepers to their emotions, their bodies, and their womb. They chose to bring those children to full term, and therefore they chose their struggle. In the majority, these women were the ones who said, well, you don't need a man, because I am proof that you can do it all by yourself. Don't depend on a man, because men may not be there. They're unreliable. They're not trustworthy. You can't depend, you can't rely, you can't trust men. Do it by yourself. Plus, you live in the West, you don't need provision, you don't need protection. We have a surrogate father call the government, a surrogate husband, call the government, should you need the option to exercise. But you can do everything by yourself. What we find is those women who are single mothers reproduce daughters and transfer their struggles to their daughters. And on two sides you have daughters that have come from two-parent families and daughters who have come from single-parent families. And both groups have the same outcomes. Why? An ideology. Mothers have been programming their daughters to fail, and in most cases, fathers have been absent to correct those ideologies, and where present, they've been too weak to advocate for the best interest of their daughters, and therefore the mother's seed is what is planted. And as a result of that today, in the West, in Great Britain, in the United Kingdom, we have a society whereby men are not stepping up to be men, and women are saying, well, I don't need a loser anyway, I can do this all by myself. Now, this always ends badly. The reason this ends badly is a simple one. Life was not supposed to be lived alone. Despite what people say, in your 20s and your 30s, such statements are valid. In your 60s and 70s and 80s, it becomes much harder to go through life without a significant other or loved ones or a family unit. In your 20s, you have friends and you can draw on the nourishment from the group, from your friends. In your 30s, you still have friends. In your 40s, you have your career and you have some friends. But what tends to happen is in your late 50s and in your 60s and in your 70s, life happens. And what we have yet to accept in this country is that the same ideology that we've seen, the ideologies that has come from the F movement, that has penetrated every part of our societal discourse, so much so that it's part of politics. We're championing people being separate, but what we haven't done is step back and said, our society, our welfare system, our healthcare system is not designed to be able to handle and accommodate old, single, unmarried women in the numbers that we are producing right now in our 20s. It's a numbers game. If most women are not having or getting married, but are reproducing at a rate lower than the replacement rate, it begs to agree that most women will not have families. And what I hope we don't, but what we are perhaps going to see is something similar to what is happening in Japan, where people are dying at 70 and 80 in their homes because there are no loved ones. There is no family. Some of these people made a choice. They were raised by their mothers based on the same ideology, not to be interdependent, not to see the value of a relationship. They were raised to think that relationships were supposed to be easy, and that because they easily fell in love, that it should be just as easy to maintain love. And at the first instance of an argument, a difficulty, what you found is they said, no, we want to be free. We don't like boundaries. We don't like structure. Relationships are too restrictive. I'm looking for a partner. I'm not looking for a husband. I'm looking for an equal. I don't want anything that forces me to stop and make compromises. I don't want constraints. There are no costs, and there will be no trade-offs from me. That is causing our society to disintegrate because we have kids that were raised to be selfish. Were raised as part of the selfish attitude to self-sabotage their relationships. As a result of that, have no appetite and have no ability to self-sustain a relationship when it comes. As a result of a self-concept based on their parents' fears, ignorance, worries and doubts, which is causing self-destruction. Self-destruction, even when we should know better. Now, I hope that's been useful.